enjoy Mr. Stephan Kinsella.
Thanks. Test. I'll do my best. I thought that the best thing to keep people awake after a long lunch on a Saturday would be a talk about John Locke, 17th century philosopher. The title is, well, I've slightly changed it, Locke's Big Mistake, How the Labor Theory of Property Ruined Political Theory.
So according to Stephan Kinsella, John Locke's labor theory of property rights undermines all of political philosophy. Locke's labor theory of property rights is based on the idea that you own yourself, and therefore you own the results of your labor. And it is a fundamental foundation of the United States and many countries, which was created after Locke came up with the idea. Locke's ideas are incorporated directly into the Declaration of Independence, common law, and are the foundation for the Homestead Act in the U.S. and many other property rights in the U.S. So what is Stephan Kinsella talking about? How could it possibly be that it ruined political theory, quote unquote?
And I'll try to explain why I think this is interesting and very relevant to our fight for liberty. Let me start with a question. Who is the most evil man of all history? Any guesses? There's no wrong answers. Well, there's some wrong answers. Mao. Who did Ayn Rand think was the most evil man in all history? Yeah, she said Kant is the most evil man in mankind's history. Well, I mean, you might not agree with his idealism, some of his philosophy, but he was a pretty good classical liberal, so I don't know if I can agree with that.
Here, Kinsella does a backhanded attack on Ayn Rand. He suggests that Immanuel Kant was a classical liberal. I don't know what his definition of a classical liberal is, but to me, one of the most important things of being a classical liberal is the defense of reason, which clearly does not include Kant. Kant attacked reason. Kant, in his famous book on epistemology, The Critique of Pure Reason, states, "I had to deny knowledge in order to make room for faith." That is a clear attack on reason and not a defense of reason. The famous mathematician Carl Friedrich Gauss was also very critical of Kant's epistemology. For instance, he criticized Kant's ideas of the distinction between synthetic and analytic concepts. He was also critical of Kant's ideas on a priori knowledge. These criticisms are very similar to Ayn Rand's criticisms of Kant's epistemology. I will give Kinsella one point, which is I don't think Kant is the most evil person in history. I think that prize in recent philosophical history would have to go to David Hume, who was the inspiration for Kant's book, Critique of Pure Reason. In all of philosophical history, that prize would have to go to Plato. In fact, Kant's epistemology is nothing but warmed over Plato. The fact that Kant is considered profound is just absurd, and here Kinsella is using this idea to attack Ayn Rand in a backhanded way. It's intellectually dishonest. And the fact Kinsella is promoting this anti-reason philosopher known as Immanuel Kant shows he is not a fan of reason.
Ayn Rand was known for rhetorical excesses. She also said patents are the heart and core of property rights.
Here we get another ad hominem attack on Ayn Rand. I don't know that she's known for rhetorical excesses at all. She, in fact, was very clear, didn't use rhetoric, didn't use rhetorical excesses to make her points. She was very logical, unlike Stephan Kinsella, who, as we've seen, endorses philosophers who attack reason and promote irrationalism. Not only is this an ad hominem attack, but he doesn't explain why Rand's statement that patents and copyrights are the heart of property rights is wrong. He doesn't present a logical argument. He just sort of makes this offhanded, dismissive comment as if this is obvious, which is the standard tactic of socialists.
Now, even if you believe in intellectual property, that one's hard to swallow. But I'll give her some credit, too. She also has a rhetorical line that I love in her money speech, which was, run for your life from any man who tells you that money is evil. That sentence is the leper's bell of the approaching looter. Love that line. I feel that way when people say they disagree with the idea of self-ownership. I'm like, well, I'm going to keep an eye on you. Well, I don't think Kant was the most evil man in all history, and I don't think Locke was either, but I do want to have a similar thesis to Ayn Rand, is that it's identifying one big mistake in political theory and philosophy. I don't think Locke did this on purpose. I think he did a lot of good, and I'm going to try to identify what I think is good in Locke and what mistake he made. I won't even say he's evil, although he was a sort of racist defender of the slave trade, but that's...
Here, Kinsella tries to smear Locke as being a racist and a supporter of the slave trade. Actually, Locke's position on slavery was much more nuanced than Kinsella makes it out to be. Again, this is a typical Marxist attack, calling them racist and smearing them. Slavery was found everywhere in the world and was very common until around the middle of the 1800s, and Locke died in 1704. The fact is that Locke's ideas did more to end slavery than any other philosopher or person in history. So this is just another ad hominem attack by this intellectual fraud, Stephan Kinsella.
Ad hominem, and we never do that here. But parts of his argument have caused a lot of serious problems in political theory in the meantime. Now, why is this? Before I get into the details, in my view, I've been thinking about libertarianism for over 25 years, and I've come to the conclusion that one problem we face is overuse of metaphors and imprecise use of language and clear thinking. We can't abolish it completely, but we have to be wary of the dangers of using metaphors and imprecise language and unclear thinking. One of America's most famous Supreme Court justices, before he was a justice, when he was a judge, said in 1926, metaphors in law are to be narrowly watched, for starting as devices to liberate thought, they often end up enslaving it. He's right. I mean, you could ask, what's a metaphor? And in Louisiana, we might say, it's so to explain things better. But sometimes there's problems. Austrians like Baum-Bawerk, Mises, Guido Hülsmann, they've all written on all the dangers of using metaphorical language. For example, all these scientific metaphors are used to explain the economy, like friction or momentum, right? The economy has green shoots right now, or maybe doesn't have green shoots. Talk about prices communicating knowledge or coordinating behavior. And also mixing of labor, which I'm going to...
Here, Kinsella is purposely taking Locke out of context. Yes, Locke does talk about the mixing of labor with natural or unclaimed resources to create property rights. But if you read the whole context of what he's saying, it's clear that he's talking about creating value. This is the same intellectually dishonest argument that Marxists always make against Locke.
Talk a little bit here. Let me ask a question, just a show of hands to the audience. Who here believes that you own your body? Okay? Who here knows pretty much what your body is? Okay? It's hard to say you own your body if you don't know what it is. Now, there's a difference, though, between whether you do own your body and whether you should own your body. Who thinks here that you own yourself? Now, who knows what their self really is? I don't know what my self really is. I mean, it's not as concrete of an idea as body ownership, right? So when we talk about self-ownership in libertarianism, really, I think we're talking about body ownership.
Here, Kinsella tries to differentiate between the body and yourself. He says it's clear that we do own or should own our body. Well, our body is just the physical part of us. Our self includes the thoughts and actions that we can take. Your body is the same whether you're dead or alive. Dead people don't have property rights. So you don't own your body when you're dead. So this is just complete rhetorical nonsense. It's also the sort of pseudo-scientific, concrete-bound, non-conceptual thinking you would expect from a fan of Immanuel Kant and David Hume. Ayn Rand talks about this attitude. She says, philosophers came to be divided into two camps. Those who claim that man obtains his knowledge of the world by deducing it exclusively from concepts which come from inside his head and are not derived from the perception of physical facts. Those are called the rationalists. And those who claim that man obtains his knowledge from experience, which was held to mean by direct perception of immediate facts, with no recourse to concepts. Those are called the empiricists. To put it more simply, those who join the mystics by abandoning reality and those who clung to reality by abandoning their mind, which is what Stephan Kinsella is doing here.
Yep. So the question is always, who owns your body? Me or someone else? Do you believe in your own control of yourself, or your body, I should say, or slavery? That's the fundamental choice. And if you talk in clear language, these things become clearer. We also have to distinguish between factual questions or legal questions and normative questions. If I say, do you own yourself? You're really thinking, should I own myself? Right? So the question is, should you own yourself and do you own yourself, are separate questions. I would say you don't own yourself completely.
Here, Kinsella proves that he doesn't understand what rights are. Just because a right of free speech is violated by a government doesn't mean that you don't have a right to free speech. Rights are the standard for whether a law is legitimate. Once again, Kinsella proves his anti-conceptual, anti-reason epistemological bias. Very David Hume and Immanuel Kant. In this case, you own yourself. That is true whether the government laws recognize that or not. Whether someone enslaves you or not, you still own yourself, not your body.
Today's legal system, because the government maintains the right to draft you, throw you in jail for doing drugs, to take your money if you don't pay taxes, or to put you in jail if you don't pay taxes. So I think we're only partly self-owners in today's society. As Stephan Molyneux mentioned earlier, a slave is someone who is a 100% tax victim, right? So we have to distinguish between should and facts. So there are some ideas, words, and terms which I think we ought to try to avoid or at least be very careful of when we use them. Let me go through a few of those. One is conflating government with society and state, or conflating society with state, or conflating government with state, or conflating country with state. The problem is, if you say you're against the government, people think you're against law and order because they think you're against the governing institutions of society, when really we're against the state. Okay? So what libertarians are against is the state. The state currently monopolizes and runs the government.
Here, Stephan Kinsella sounds like a pseudo-intellectual college freshman, trying to make a distinction between the state and the government. So I did some investigation as to what people mean by the state and the government. According to AI, the state is a permanent, abstract political entity that includes the people, the territory, sovereignty, and the government. While government is a temporary group of people, leaders, and agencies currently running it. So I think it would be fair to say, in fact, libertarians are against the government. That is, the people who are presently running the government. They're not against the state. The state is the abstract entity that includes the people. They're not against the people. These people who are against the government are often for the entity that is the state. That is, the United States or Canada or Australia, for example. In fact, they're often more patriotic than the people in the government. So I would say this is a bunch of nonsense. It's an attempt by Kinsella to sound intellectual, when in fact it shows profound stupidity.
The governing organizations of society, law, justice, order. The state also runs the roads, but we don't say we're against roads, do we? We say we're against government roads, or state roads, we should say. Just like we say we're against state education. Okay? So we have to be careful when we say we're against government, because you'll have minarchists or regular people think that you're for chaos and lawlessness, sort of anarchist, the idea of the anarchist with the bomb. So we have to say we're against the state, if you want to be clear and precise. Another one is people say, well, I'm against coercion, I'm a libertarian, or I'm against violence. Well, no, we're not against violence, and we're not even against coercion. We're against aggression. Aggression is the initiated use of force, or the initiated violence, or initiated coercion. Coercion is just a type of force, right? It means to use force to compel someone to do something. Someone's breaking in my house, I'm going to coerce the guy, and it's rightful. So we're not against coercion, we're not against force, we're not against violence. We're against initiated force, coercion, and violence, or aggression. Another one, which I'll deal with in a few minutes, is labor versus action. People always talk about owning the fruits of your labor. People have a right to sell their labor, these kinds of things. They act like labor is some special thing. Now, I don't know about you, but to me, labor is just a type of action. Humans own their bodies. We act in certain ways. That's human action. Labor is just a type of action, maybe a subset of action. What kind of action is it? It's action that has disutility, some people say. It's not leisure. It's not fun. You do it to get some end. but it's just one type of action. Okay? And then there's, of course, intellectual property, which begs the question just by saying it that way, right? Some of us don't think it should be property, so don't call it property to prove that it should be treated as property.
Until it's right. It shouldn't be called intellectual property. It should be just called property rights. There's no such thing as property. There's no entity called property. There are property rights, which is the relationship between a person or persons and a thing. And yes, there should be property rights in inventions and art. Those are the fundamental basis of all property rights.
It's better to call it an intellectual privilege or just call it patent and copyright, what the government calls it. Finally, another one, which Jeff Tucker and I were talking about on the way up here this morning, is the idea of limited government. This one always bugs me because, every government that's ever existed is limited.
Here again, Kinsella is playing fast and loose with the context of these concepts. When people talk about limited government, they're talking about legal restrictions on what the government can and cannot do. In fact, there are many governments and politicians that think that there should be no limit to government. That, of course, is what the Marxists think. They think that everything should be controlled by the government. As Mussolini stated, fascism's core idea is that everything in the state, nothing outside the state, nothing against the state. That is unlimited government. Yes, I'm for a limited government. Kinsella's hair splitting here is just context dropping. It's pseudo-intellectual bullshit.
There's never been an unlimited government. I mean, maybe the Nazis, maybe the Russians at a certain point in time. But every government has limits, or every state, I should say, right? Has limits on what it can do. And almost everyone believes in some limits. So the welfare liberals believe in a limited government. They just want the limits to be a lot less than we would like. So what defines a conservative, an ultra-minimalist conservative, or a classical liberal, or a libertarian? It's not that we believe in limited government. It's what limits we believe there should be on the state, right? And the most consistent, most radical libertarians think that the limits should be complete. It means the state should have nothing it could do whatsoever. In other words, the state should die and not exist. But even a minarchist believes that the limits should be completely so tight that the state can only do a few minimal functions: defense, police, and courts. Okay? So when you say limited government, that doesn't really distinguish us from others. Okay? So in thinking about how to define the essence of libertarianism over the years, I think the best way to think of it is that we recognize that we are all people who live in society with each other. We all, at least the civilized people among us, we generally want our own lives to be good, and we also favor peace and prosperity. We want our neighbors to be good, and we like living in society with each other. And we all realize the following. We realize, this is Mises I'm going to go into here a little bit. Mises was, in my mind, the greatest Austrian economist, and he developed a theory called praxeology. That's the logic or the science of human action.
Praxeology is supposed to be the science of human action. Its fundamental thesis is that people act to achieve ends. This is so trivial as to be meaningless. But what makes it even more meaningless is when you realize that Mises did not believe that ethics could ever be rational. So these ends are just arbitrarily picked ends. So what's the difference between goal-directed action, where the goals are random, and non-goal-directed action? The Austrians who prattle on and on about praxeology never say anything the science has ever discovered except this goal-directed action. This is the biggest bunch of hooey I've ever heard.
But why do you call them shit?
Because they are shit.
So what Mises says is just, and this is not, it sounds funny, it's a weird word. It took me a long time to understand it, like epistemology took 17 years before I finally started using the word, right? I'm still not there with ontology, but with epistemology and praxeology I am. Mises says, look, it's common sense. Look at human action. What do human beings do in their lives? Every moment of their lives, they're taking an action. Now, an action means you're an intelligent, rational person. You understand something about the world. You know that the future is coming. And you envision something about the future you think is going to happen that you're not satisfied with or that you want to change. This is what human action is. We don't think of it like this, but this is what we do in every moment of our lives. And we also realize that we have the ability to affect that future. How? By using what Mises calls scarce means. These are things in the world that you can use to change the course of the future, including your body and including things that we find, tools, basically. And we have some understanding or some knowledge in our mind that we've accumulated from human civilization and from society in the past, from others, from learning, from emulation. We have some knowledge about what we think is coming, what we think might satisfy us better than what would come if we don't take an action, and what means are available and how they will causally change things. So that's what human action is. It's understanding, making a choice, grabbing some kind of means, and employing that means to change the future. This is how we have to understand human action. And within that framework, we can understand libertarianism is the idea that we understand that these means are scarce. Scarce means rivalrous. It means only one person can use this thing at a time. Otherwise, you'll have two or more people fighting over this thing, clashing over it, having conflict, violent disagreement.
So according to Kinsella, libertarianism means that we understand that the means to achieve our goals are scarce. Then every economist is a libertarian. This is just unadulterated BS, and it's designed to set up his next arguments, that there are rivalrous goods. This idea of rivalrous goods comes from a progressive economist from Harvard, i.e. a socialist, Richard Musgrave. Not surprisingly, Richard Musgrave was born in Germany and studied philosophy and economics at a German university, which means he got a supersized serving of the socialist's favorite philosopher, Immanuel Kant. I did a whole video on this. This idea of rivalrous versus non-rivalrous goods is a socialist idea. It's not a libertarian idea. It's not a freedom-oriented idea. It's complete nonsense. It ignores the simple fact that property rights are based not on rivalrous versus non-rivalrousness. Property rights are based on the simple moral principle that if you create something, you own it.
So an example would be, baking a cake. You need a recipe, which is the knowledge of how to make the cake, and you need the tools, the capital equipment, the ingredients, the raw materials. Only one person can use this egg at a time to make the cake, or this wooden spoon, or this bowl, or this oven, right? But any number of people could use their own eggs and their own ingredients, all using the same recipe or the same knowledge at the same time. This is exactly why the intellectual property idea is so fallacious. Intellectual property seeks to...
The intellectual dishonesty here of Stephan Kinsella is off the charts. He purposely equates inventions to recipes for baking bread. Nothing could be further from the truth. In fact, inventions are scarce and are subject to scarcity. There's only so many inventors, there's only so much research facilities, and it takes time and effort to create inventions. So this is just nonsense, and it violates the obvious moral principle that if you create something, you own it. And this is straightforward Locke, an intellectual fraud by Kinsella.
grant property rights in the ideas as well as we do in the scarce means. It makes no sense because you don't need to put property rights in the ideas because they're not scarce. The entire purpose of property rights is to permit conflicts to be avoided in the use of the scarce means of action.
According to Kinsella, property rights are just a socially useful tool to avoid conflicts and to distribute resources efficiently. Of course, this gives you no idea why it is that you own a car or why it is that you own a house. In fact, if someone else has a more socially useful purpose for your car or your house or anything else you own, they should be able to take it and make it their property, according to Kinsella. This is socialism. The idea that this guy is for liberty is just nonsense. This guy's a socialist through and through.
So we can all go about our daily business and our plans, cooperating with each other, trading with each other, helping each other, selling to each other, using our own scarce resources with the legally recognized exclusive right to control it. That's what property rights are. That's what ownership is. It makes no sense to grant these rights in ideas. Now, I'm not going to go into that in detail. That's the entire intellectual property argument I've been making for a few years now, but I just want to put it in the framework. This is what the libertarian idea is. Now, what does this have to do with Locke? Okay, so the way to reformulate this is to think that the essence of libertarianism is a very simple set of rules. As I mentioned earlier, we can't say we're for limited government because that doesn't distinguish us from other schools of thought. And you can't say we're for property rights because that doesn't distinguish us either. Why not? Because property rights are inherent in every human society, in every political system that's ever existed. Communists believe in property rights.
This is perhaps the most idiotic statement I've ever heard. Communists believe in property rights? Every society believes in property rights? That's just BS. Put in the everyone's number for having listened to you clip here.
Socialists believe in property rights. Fascists believe in property rights. Environmentalists believe in property rights. Welfare liberals believe in property rights. We believe in property rights. What's the difference? How they're assigned. That's the difference. So we look at the world and we see scarce resources that need to be controlled by someone, by the legal system, so that they can be used peacefully, productively. And our rule is simple. It's the Lockean rule. The Lockean rule basically says whoever can show the better claim to a resource gets it. And the better claim is defined as either the first person who transformed it, yes, with his labor, in a sense, or if you acquired it by contract from someone else. It's very simple. Contract plus first appropriation. Now, what's the reason for the first appropriation rule? Now, Locke spelled this out in his argument. If no one had the right to be the first one to use a resource, it could never be used. Someone has got to be the first one to use this unowned thing out there. And if he's got the right to use it, then he's got a right to keep it, because otherwise the second guy can take it from him, which is not a property right system. That's a system of violent clashing. So it's almost like the Misesian monetary regression theorem, right? When you trace back the origin of the value of gold-type money to its pure commodity, non-monetary use. It's like that. You can see who's got a resource now, trace the title back to the first act of appropriation. This is what we say. Now, you could add one more rule. You could say that if someone commits an act of aggression, some kind of tort, you harm someone else, you violate their rights. Because you perform that action, you have committed, you've incurred an obligation to compensate them, right? So they might get a claim to your property because of that. So we could modify the rules. The person who owns a resource is either the person who acquired it by contract from an owner, or who first appropriated it, or who acquired it because of some act of crime by the original owner, okay? Other than that, there's no other ways to own property. Now, what did Locke say? What Locke said, he basically said this, but he had some extra stuff in his argument. Locke said, God created the universe. God owns the universe. God created Adam and Eve, he owned them. But God, in his benevolence, he's apparently a libertarian, granted dominion of all the unowned resources that he created to man. So within the human sphere, whether there's a God or not, whether you care that God's our slave owner or how you look at that, the point is that there's a system set up where the rule is that each man is a self-owner. That's what Locke called it. And remember, the danger of saying self-owner, better to say he's a body owner, because that's the resource in dispute, right? I care if someone stabs my body, not if they stab myself, okay? So every person is a self-owner, and then here's what Locke said, and here's the problem, I think, with Locke's argument. Locke said, if you own yourself, then you own the labor you perform with your body or yourself. First off, I'm thinking right now it's a critical libertarian legal theory, legal theorist who wonders what words mean. Like, I'm kind of a nagging feeling is, what does that really mean to own your labor? But I'll go with that. And then Locke says, so you own this labor. Now, I'm thinking like a substance, emanating from myself.
I'm thinking of a substance like emitting from myself? What the? We all know what labor means. He's trying to distort the definition to get the result he wants. And yes, you own your own labor. That means that you have it and that someone else doesn't have it. It means that you're not a slave. This is straightforward, and he's trying to pretend that this is more complicated than it is. It's another example of Kinsella's anti-conceptual Humean epistemology.
And so if it mixes with something unowned, well, I own the labor, so the only way I can keep ownership of that labor is to own the thing it's mixed with. Otherwise, you're taking my labor away from me, right? So this is his argument for why we can appropriate unowned resources. Now, David Hume, writing later, that Locke was in the 1600s, Hume was a little bit later, pointed out, and I agree with Hume, Hume pointed out that this argument of Locke's is overly figurative or metaphorical.
What a surprise. He points to David Hume, who was an anti-reason, anti-enlightenment philosopher. He was also anti-John Locke. It goes along with his love of Immanuel Kant. It just proves, once again, my point. Any attack on reason is an attack on freedom. Stephan Kinsella is not a libertarian. He's an anti-reason Marxist. Hume rejected the whole idea that you could have a rational ethics, which is why, of course, he rejects Locke's point on property rights. Locke's position is the very obvious moral point, that if you create something, you're the owner of it.
We don't really own our labor. We own our bodies. If you own your body, that means you have the right to perform whatever actions you want with it, and you can use those to sell your services to someone. But think about it. If someone pays me to sing a song, they give me $1 after I sing a song for them. The song pleased them. But do they own the song now? Are they in possession of a song? No, they're in possession of a memory. Can I say that I gave them a memory? I suppose, but I didn't really own a memory that I transferred to them. This is all completely imprecise.
There's nothing imprecise about this at all. If you pay someone to perform a song, they've given you the labor. You've been able to direct their labor, to sing the song. They clearly own their labor, which is why Kinsella has tried to make such a stupid distinction between the body and labor. It's not that they're buying the song, they're buying the action, that is your labor, that you're taking to sing the song. This is the stupid, concrete, bound, anti-conceptual thinking that Kinsella is pushing. This is common with what I call pure empiricists, of which Hume was one of, who basically rejected the idea that cause and effect exist.
Metaphorical stuff. And you don't need it. It's unnecessary. As Hume pointed out, Locke's argument works if you simplify it and you take out this stuff. Locke's argument works because, for the reasons I mentioned earlier, the libertarian reason. When you have an object that is disputed or contested, a scarce resource, then there really can be no other answer than that the person has a better claim to it that was the first one to appropriate it. Because if you don't give him that right, then, as I said, no one could ever appropriate anything in the first place. Or they would appropriate it with violence and people squabbling over it, which, again, defeats the purpose of having a legal system that permits resources to be used in a conflict-free way. Okay? So this is the problem. Now, you might say, well, he could have worded it better, but what's the problem with this? The problem is this entire mentality, this entire approach has led to a deep, vast confusion that has contaminated and infected political theory ever since his day. Arguably, it also at least partially contributed to the rise of a related doctrine called the labor theory of value, which is more of an economic idea, which is what contaminated Ricardo's and Adam Smith's and then Marx's thought, right?
Here, Kinsella confuses the labor theory of value of classical economics with the labor theory of value of Marx. In fact, the labor theory of value in classical economics was not telling you what the value or price of an item was. It was telling you, because people lived in the Malthusian trap, that the tendency was that the price of the item would tend to was the price that was necessary to sustain their life or their labor. This was a very reasonable point of view for people living in the Malthusian trap. I've done a whole video on point.
Labor theory of value has this mystical idea that, the value of a product is based upon the labor that went into it. Now, there's several mistakes here. Number one, value is subjective, right? There's no value in things. So, right away, he's thinking in intrinsic value terms. Makes no sense whatsoever.
Once again, Kinsella is proving it's value that is not subjective. Values are objective. Prices are subjective. This mistake is made over and over again. He talks about being precise. He's not precise at all. Even in economics, prices are not completely subjective. I've done a whole video on point. The basic unit of economics is energy, not currency. If you don't get enough energy, you die. If you make enough economic transactions where you end up with negative energy, then you end up dying. All of economics is not subjective.
As Menger and the Austrians have shown, right? And furthermore, you don't own labor. Labor is not a substance. And of course, the idea that you have two laborers who mix their labor with two objects, one's high quality, one's low quality. If this guy put 100 hours into it and this guy did it in 10, they're not going to have the same value. So then you have to reverse engineer your theory and say, well, now we have to have a multiplier coefficient on this guy's labor. So then you just kind of have a contorted theory. Anyway, that's the labor theory of value, which resulted in communism and hundreds of millions of deaths. So, if Locke's to blame for that, I guess we could say he's a little.
So according to Stephan Kinsella, Locke is responsible for communism and the deaths of hundreds of millions of people. I mean, this is intellectual fraud on a scale that is beyond the pale. It's criminal. This guy is just a complete charlatan. Locke is responsible for the United States of America, not the Soviet Union. How stupid is this guy?
A little bit negligent. But I won't blame Locke for that because, you can trace these ideas back to Muslim thinkers back in the 1200s, a long time ago. But there's some evidence that this idea of labor as this thing people can own, this metaphorical approach, did lead to the Marxian labor theory of value. But the problem with Locke is the labor theory of property. Again, the idea that you own things that you mix your labor with. This is obviously not true. For example, if I'm an employee of a company, which Marx would abolish, I guess, right? And I'm paid to mix my labor to build a chair out of the employer's wood and nails. Well, I mix my labor with it. Why don't I own it? Well, because there's...
This is so sophomoric. The obvious answer here is that you were paid for your labor. And in the contract that you made in order to get paid for your labor, you agree to give up those things that you create. On top of that, you probably don't own the materials that were used to produce the item. So this is straightforward contract law. This is the sort of anti-conceptual, anti-reason BS by Kinsella that's intellectual fraud.
Contract, and I never owned it in the first place. Okay? So the problem with the labor theory of property is it has led to this idea, libertarians will say this all the time, sort of casual thinking, not very precise. They'll say there are three sources of property ownership. Number one, if you find something, original appropriation or homesteading, right? Locke's idea, the libertarian idea. Number two, by contract, by contractual acquisition. They're right about that. If you want to mention a third, it should be some kind of aggression, which I mentioned can trigger a property title transfer, but that's a way of transferring title that exists already. So let's say finding something or by contract from a previous owner. And then they'll say the third way you can own something is by creation. See, what they're doing is they're going back to this labor idea. They're mixing things together. They're thinking humans are productive. We labor. Our labor, our intellect, our intellectual creativity helps create things of value. And just as I labor in a field and make a valuable firm out of it, I must own that because I labored on it, which means I own anything that I create with my labor. You see how they go from one argument to the next? They never stop and ask the question, well, what's an ownable thing in the first place? And then sometimes they'll argue by possessives, the most maddening thing. Like, well, if I don't own my labor, who does? Well, the word my means I have to own it. I have a wife, my girlfriend, my job, my customers. Do I own those because there's a possessive? No, sloppy thinking. So another dangerous word that I wanted to get to is the word property. We have this tendency to refer to things that we own as property, like, this iPad is my property. Now, I think it would be better to say this scarce resource, I have a property right in this scarce resource, or I own this scarce resource. Because when you start saying that's my property, look, think about why the word property was used in the first place. Locke said you have a propriety in your things. What he's talking about is that when a human being acts in the world, right? We don't just use our bodies. We have standing room, we have other scarce resources that we employ to affect change, as I mentioned. All these things are sort of within the orbit of your control. They're a property of yourself in the sense that they're a feature of yourself. They're a characteristic of yourself. They're a way of describing part of your nature or your identity. Okay? So what they're talking about is what's proper to man. What's proper for a man to be able to rightfully control. So that's why the word property and property rights is used now. It's like a type of metonymy, if you know what that is, to refer to the thing itself. But if we think clearly, we never arrive at the question most intellectual property advocates do, for example, which is, well, the question is, what is property? No, that's not the question. The question is who owns this resource, always. Because nothing else can be fought over. Because resources are necessarily things that can be fought over or contested. So the question in all of political philosophy is always, always, if you can point to a given resource, something that more than one person desires to use and there's potentially conflict over, who should rightfully be able to control it or own it or have a property right in. But don't call it property unless you're really careful about it. If you call it property, then you're going to end up with intellectual property and things like this. Okay? So the problem with the argument is that, that there are three sources of ownership or property, is that it conflates the source of wealth with the source of property rights. So it is completely true that if I own some raw materials, let's say some paper and, or let's say some wood and some metal, and I fashion these things into a chair, I have made an object that is more valuable. More valuable to who? To me, or maybe to a potential customer. Remember, there's no value in the chair. Value is not intrinsic. It's not objective. Value is a subjective relationship between valuing acting human beings. So anyway, I transform resources into a more valuable shape. Or we could say, in economic terms, I have created wealth. Why have I created wealth? Because I've made something more valuable to me or someone else. In fact, if two people just trade their objects, two people trade an apple for an orange, they have created wealth by that transaction, right? It's not, as classical economists say, a horizontal trade where the values are equal. In fact, the guy who buys the apple with his orange values the apple more than the orange, and vice versa. That's why they engage in the trade. So each one is better off after the trade. So wealth is created just by pure trade. Wealth is also created by humans laboring on their property. Wealth can also be destroyed. If you make a mistake and you ruin your property in an attempt to make a machine or something, then you can lose wealth. But the property rights don't change, right? In fact, for me to make a chair presupposes that I owned the raw materials. I already own these raw materials. How did I get them? One of the first two ways. I either bought them by contract from a previous owner, or I homesteaded them from the state of nature. That's it. So this ownership starts already before the act of creation or the act of...
For a guy who's constantly talking about being precise, this is the most imprecise statement and purposely deceptive. You can't homestead these resources because homesteading means that you actually made something of value. That was just natural resources before. You have to do something to first make these things valuable, to make them your property. So this is just nonsense on stilts. You don't own these resources until you make something out of them that's valuable.
Production. The act of production is an act of laboring, using your labor, sure, on materials that you already own. Or it could be on someone else's materials, if you're an employee working on someone else's materials, and then you don't own it. So the key is always who owns the raw materials to go into productive labor. So creation, labor, is a source of wealth, but it's not a source of property rights. And if you realize that, you'll never fall into the trap of wondering, well, who owns that labor? Who owns that poem? Well, naturally, a poem doesn't spring out of nowhere. If you believe a poem is an ownable thing, or a movie, or a song, or a pattern of information, or a discovery, or a fact, or a database, well, I agree with Tibor Machan. The best candidate for owning that is the guy who created it. But this presupposes that these things are ownable. Not everything is ownable. My memories are not ownable. My love is not ownable. My past is not ownable. The Earth's rotation is not ownable. These are characteristics, ways of describing the universe.
Here he purposely conflates natural phenomena with creation. That is, songs and poems in this case. This is just intellectual fraud.
You could say, as a practical matter, that I own my actions or I own my memory because I can control them. But if you say it like that, you make the mistake of double counting, right? Because you're saying, well, I own my body and I own my actions. Well, no, you have the ability to control what actions you perform because you own your body. It's a consequence. It's derivative. It's not a separate, independent thing. So if we can clear up our thinking in this way, how are we doing on time, by the way?
I think you're fine.
Okay. If we clear up these confusions, then a lot of confusions in thinking arise. So as I said, property, limited government, state. let me talk a little bit about one thing I touched on, which is an objection I hear a lot. This is about contracts. Now, I hear this all the time about this labor argument I give. They say, well, if you don't own your labor, how can you sell it? Right? I hear this all the time. Now, this is because people don't usually have a sophisticated or deep understanding of contract law in general, much less what I think is the libertarian view, which is the Rothbardian Evers view, which he calls the title transfer theory of contract. I don't want to get too much into legal theory, but let me just tell you what I think is a simple way to look at the right way to look at contract. First of all, in today's legal system, the way contracts are viewed as binding obligations. And that's how most libertarians look at it. If I make a promise to you in a certain formality, with a certain formality, in a certain way, then the law, even a private law in an anarchist society, should enforce that promise. Your promises should be binding. Okay? However, even in today's legal system, which characterizes the contractual realm that way, it doesn't operate that way. So, for example, if I promise to sing a song for you at your son's birthday party, and I decide not to show up, then you can't go get the cops to drag me there and make me sing for several reasons. Number one, it wouldn't be a very good song, right? I'm being compelled. And that's a practical consideration the courts use. Courts generally don't enforce what's called specific performance, which means they don't actually treat contracts as binding promises. What they do is they make me pay $1,000 damages to the guy, in a contract lawsuit, which means really what the contract is just a transfer of title to property. It's as if I had said, I'm predicting that I will sing at your son's birthday party tomorrow. I'm just making a prediction because I know myself pretty well, and I don't think I'll change very much between now and then. I can't bind myself because I might change my mind. But I tell you what, to give myself and my future self an inducement to sing, I will hereby transfer to you $1,000 in damage payments conditioned upon my not singing. Okay, that's fine. So that's what the contract is. It's really a transfer of title to property. And that's what Rothbard said. Rothbard said contracts should not be viewed as binding obligations or promises. They should only be viewed as transfers of title to owned resources. I just said property. See, I made the mistake too. And if you think about it, this is perfectly consistent with and an outcome of the two sources of property rights, the Lockean idea that I mentioned earlier, which is the idea that you own things because of first appropriation or by contract. So contract here means the owner of a resource has the ability to give up his ownership of it in favor of someone else, to transfer it to them. That's what contracts are. That's how they need to be viewed. So how do we reconcile this with the idea that you can sell your labor, like in an employment contract or a service contract? The problem here is the person making the objection to my argument, the person arguing for IP in effect, the person trying to argue that labor is an ownable thing because you can have a contract regarding it. What they're doing is they're thinking in terms of the standard simple contract like the apple versus the orange, right? A typical contract would be two people exchanging titles, apple for orange, okay? It's an exchange. It's a contract. But remember, the definition of contract I mentioned doesn't talk about exchange. It just talks about transfer. So if I give my niece a $1,000 gift to go to college, that's a contract. It's a transfer of title. It's not an exchange. Not really. I mean, you could say I get pleasure out of it, right? But it's definitely not a bilateral exchange. It's a one-way exchange. And this is how we have to think of employment contracts or service contracts. The sale of labor is another dangerous, confusing metaphor. The sale of labor is not really a metaphor. It's not really what happens. It's not literally true. What's happening here is people are analogizing this labor contract to a regular exchange. And they're thinking, well, if there's something being sold, there must be an exchange of title. And what's being sold? Title to the labor. No. It's like the example I gave earlier about the singing. What's being done is the buyer of my services, you could say, knows that I own my body. He knows I have the power to decide not to sing, or to pay an expense or not to pay an expense. He knows he's got to motivate me to do what he wants me to do. Just because this guy wants something and is willing to pay for it doesn't mean that thing is an ownable good. He might want it to rain tomorrow. He might want there to be national, peace in the world tomorrow. These are the ends of action, but they're not ownable things. Scarce means are what we use to accomplish ends. They are ownable things. The ends of action are often intangible. I mean, I might pursue a girl and buy her roses because I want her to go out with me. I want her to marry me and be my wife. But that end is getting a wife. It's got nothing to do with an ownable thing. We have to give up the idea that just because you pursue something and you pay money for it means that the thing you paid for is an ownable thing. There's the same thing with a service contract. I want this guy to sing a song. So I know that he's going to refuse to sing it unless I compensate him. So I make a deal with him. I say, if you sing, I will transfer $1,000 to you. In other words, I hereby transfer $1,000 to you conditioned upon your singing this song. If he sings it, he triggers a condition, the money transfers. Did he buy the song? No. Did he buy the singing? I guess, in a metaphorical sense, as long as you keep in mind that no title was transferred back. It was an outcome that I wanted. Okay? So the argument goes, well, you have to own something to sell it. So I just think I showed why that's incorrect. So the fact that there's labor contracts doesn't show that labor is ownable. Okay? Now the opposite would be what Walter Block has argued with me before. He says, well, if you own something, you have to be able to sell it, which goes towards voluntary slavery, right? So he says, Stephan, if you own your body, then surely you can sell it in a slavery contract. It should be enforceable. So his argument is that if you own something, you have to sell it. Now, what's the assumption here? The assumption is that ownership implies the right to sell, but it doesn't. Ownership means the exclusive right to control something, right? You have to have something else to make something sellable. And in my view, this is a little bit of a tangent, but my view is there are two ways of acquiring two types of property. One is your body. We own our bodies not because we homestead the bodies. We don't acquire our bodies. We can't exist without our bodies. Okay? That's part of our identity or our essence, our existence. There's another reason we own our bodies, and that's because we have a close connection to our bodies. We have a unique, direct control over those resources. Okay? So it's not homesteading. Locke alludes to this a little bit with the idea that God gives everyone the propriety to themselves. He doesn't talk about homesteading there, really. Okay? And for things that were previously unowned out in the world, we own those because we have first appropriation or some contract after that. Okay? So for all these things, the first idea is that ownership means you have the exclusive right to control it. Nothing in that implies the right to sell. Not immediately, not directly. But then we recognize, well, this thing was unowned before. I'm the one who acquired it. I have the right to abandon this thing, right? I can unown it, so to speak. I can return it to the state of nature. And because of that power, which is an implication of the nature of these scarce resources, and an implication of how we come to own these things, that gives you the practical ability to abandon it in favor of someone else. You know, I can take this apple, and instead of throwing it into the woods, I can hand it to you. Instead of loaning it to you, I could say, I now release my claims. Now I've given up my ownership. Now you're holding this unowned thing. You instantly re-homestead it. This is why things that have been homesteaded can be sold. It's not because you own them. It's because of the way they were acquired. Things that can be acquired can be deacquired. But we don't acquire our bodies, and our bodies were never unowned. From the moment you were a legal person or a philosophical person, you were identified and tightly bound up with a body. I'm not going to get into the metaphysical or religious idea of whether you have a soul and whether you are just your body or whether there's so. I don't care. It makes no difference. If you're just a body, then your body owns your body. Fine. You know, don't give me nonsense about, well, that makes no sense, because what I hear is you don't think I'm a self-owner. That means you think you're my owner or someone else is. So I'm going to keep an eye on you. Okay? How much time do I have for Q&A? Okay. Let me mention one thing for 2 more minutes. There are some libertarians like Adam Mossoff, Richard Epstein. They're trying to rehabilitate Locke. They're trying to show that Locke did believe that intellectual property was a natural right, which he didn't.
Here, Stephan Kinsella is just lying. Locke clearly did think that intellectual property, that is, inventions and art, are subject to property rights. As this quote points out, this guy is just a charlatan.
It's wrong. Locke did believe in intellectual property, but just for prudential reasons, like the same reason the founders did. Locke, in fact, did not believe that his homesteading theory implied that intellectual property is a type of right, which means I think he realized that he was using an overly metaphorical description. So I think he would have taken my side on this. And number 2, so what? I don't care what Locke believed. If Locke believed in intellectual property, he was dead wrong, just like he was wrong about slavery.
The only thing that is appropriate to say about this long, rambly, illogical speech is
What you just said
is one of the most insanely idiotic things I have ever heard. At no point in your rambling, incoherent response were you even close to anything that could be considered a rational thought. Everyone in this room is now dumber for having listened to it.